שלום, מלאך עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. שלום, מלאך שלום, מלאך עליון, ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. אוי אוי ברכו לי לשלום, מלאכי שלום, מלאכי עליון. אוי 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 ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. בצאתכם לשלום, מלאכי השלום, מלאכי השרת, מלאכי עליון. אוי 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 ממלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, הקדוש ברוך הוא. לה 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 כשושנה בין החוכים, כשושנה בין החוכים, כן רעייתי בין הבנות. כשושנה בין החוכים, כשושנה בין החוכים, כן רעייתי בין הבנות. כשושנה בין החוכים, כשושנה בין החוכים, כן רעייתי בין הבנות. כשושנה בין החוכים, כשושנה בין החוכים, כן רעייתי בין הבנות. כשושנה בין החוכים,
Hey, everybody. Welcome to second day Rosh HaShanah, Beit Midrash. Literally means house of study. In the old days, it was my taking any questions about what I talked about on first day Rosh Hashanah. And today's discussion is animated by the fact that Rabbi Manning and I have had occasional discussions on existentialism. As soon as we began talking to each other, we found out that we had a very similar library, very similar stories. And we keep saying, we just got to sit down and talk about this. And we thought, why not do it in public? Because you guys can benefit from our having a discussion we've actually never had. This is not rehearsed. It's the first time we're actually having a talk about existentialism. All right. Rabbi Manning, would you like to give a little intro on your side?
So we've had 28 years to prepare for this
We
moment.
had 28 years to prepare for this day. Yeah. We could have taken 29, but, it's early, but we might as well just get to it, right?
You don't know this, but probably without existentialism, I never would have found my way to you or to Oratora. So I'd like to
Tell it.
share a
Yeah, that
little-
sounds great. Nor would I have.
share a little story about that. So more than 28 years ago, I happened to be on the mailing list of the University of Judaism, and they sent me the extension catalog. And I hadn't been in school for a little while, and I looked through the catalog, and I found a class that interested me, and it was Judaism and Existentialism.
I taught it?
No.
No, somebody else taught. Okay, because I don't think I ever offered that class, right?
So I show up for the first night of class, and the person tells me, "You're the only one who signed up for it,
Oh, no.
so we're canceling the class." And I was disappointed.
Yeah.
And she said, "But the same teacher is teaching another class, and he's teaching it in an hour and a half. So if you want to hang around," I'd never actually been to the campus. "If you want to hang around, check out his class, sit in on the first one, and if you like it, you can take that class." And I said, "Well, what's that class?" And she said, "It's Martin Buber's I and Thou."
Oh,
and I happen to have read Martin Buber's I and Thou and had a lot of questions about it. It's a very deep book. I know you did a master's
I
thesis
did
on it.
my undergraduate senior project, for which I received the creative, the creative something for that graduating year at USC.
Very
It
nice.
was really, I poured myself into it. People told me it was impenetrable. I had to learn a little German, and out of nowhere, creative scholarship award. So
Very
I was
nice.
hooked on Buber.
Yes, with the Walter Kaufman translation and introduction, that 28-page introduction to that book really opened the book for me.
Yeah.
In fact, you can almost read the introduction and not the book.
You're right. Well, we're going to talk about Walter Kaufmann,
Right.
but he, for both of us, has just opened up so much of this German philosophy. And there's nobody but the Germans, right, aside from Kaufmann, who's German.
Exactly. So I take this class. I remember the guy's first name. It was Gary, but he said he went to graduate school with you. He'd known you. And the reason why it came up, because I had never heard of you still, is that at the end of the class, he had to go back to doing his regular job. I think he was a contractor. And I said, well...
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah. He was a member of our congregation. He studied.
Was he?
Yeah.
I don't know. But I said, well, recommend somebody to me to take a class from. And he said, take a class from Rabbi Mordecai Finley. And I said, well, what should I take? Whatever he's teaching. So then I signed up for Introduction to Jewish Spirituality and fell in love with your teaching style, with what you talked about. The vocabulary resonated with me. I thought it was a really good fit. You piqued my curiosity. I wanted more. And because of that, I thought, I'm going to check out this congregation. And
Here we are.
here we are.
Yeah.
So without existentialism, I wouldn't be here.
Same for me, as you know. I've told the story often how I found existentialism. My older sister took a class at Compton College on existentialism. When she went off to Spain, she left her books at home, and I was a ninth grader in Linwood, and I started reading these books, and I remember thinking, wow, there's a world out there that I did not know existed. I read Camus' The Plague. What a strange book, right? And then I had Sartre's Nausea.
Got
they
that
did-
one right here.
I did not know what it was about, other than I had not read anything like it. And so then I got into the more philosophic. And I was, anybody who knew me well, I was an existentialist. And which set me up for, I mean, there's a line. Let me actually outline a little bit. Because existentialism, one of its themes is not relying on preset systems and systematic philosophers and so forth. So there's a tendency to go back to language. So instead of a system created in language, let's go back to language itself. How does language function? How does language control our ideas? And then from language, you start studying nature of myth, poetry, and so forth. So many existentialist authors, such as Heidegger, take a linguistic turn. Heidegger after Time and Being. So then when I encountered Kabbalah, I already understood a language symbolic system. You don't have to believe in it dogmatically. You have to believe in it poetically. So Kabbalah for me was the best poem on the true nature of the human being. And so without that existentialist journey that we can fill in a little bit, but for me it was the linguistic turn in existentialism, and also the sense that we are self-creating, that we have profound personal responsibility and choice to find our way. And I chose that way, but it was an existentialist decision. So, and then everything comes after that. And then Mirav and I, actually, I'm gonna look at Mirav for a second, because Mirav and I had many conversations about what to name our synagogue. And we studied Buber and Rosenzweig, and one discussion that Mirav and I had, we want to create a place where the I-thou experience can happen. That was one of our controlling ideas, that people could actually strip away all the ideology and just encounter the depth of another human being, and part of our job was to lead people there. So, I mean, it's very Buberian in our synagogue foundation.
That's a beautiful creation story for Oren
it is.
Torah.
Thank you.
And of course, without light, we can't understand anything.
Yeah. All right, so let's. Anything? I have a little definition of existentialism that
Good.
I
I
just
think
showed
that
you.
would be a good place to start for everybody.
I have misplaced my Walter Kaufman critique of religion and philosophy. You and I have both been enamored of Walter Kaufman lately, so we might do a little bit of.
And I never knew he was such a funny guy.
Oh, he's off the chain funny in his acerbic wit, and puts everybody down, agrees with nobody. He's savage. So this is his introduction in his book, Critique, Religion, and Philosophy. Existentialism is not a philosophy, but a label for several different revolts against traditional philosophy. So we'll talk about that. The so-called existentialists, Sartre came up with the term, and nobody likes it. Share preoccupation with dread, death, and the despair. I think he's laughing as he's writing it. And dauntlessness, got to have a fourth D, as well as the conviction that English-speaking philosophy does not deserve the name philosophy. And finally, a heartfelt aversion for each other. Is that a great definition of existentialism?
What a curmudgeon.
Yeah, what a curmudgeon, but a funny curmudgeon. So tell us a little about Walter Kaufmann.
So he was born in Germany, I think 1915, 1920, I don't
About
remember, early.
1920, I think,
yeah.
something like that.
And I don't know too much about him, but I know that at the age of 12, he decided that he was going to convert to Judaism. Now, what kind of 12-year-old, first of all, is thinking about those types of things and then makes that kind of decision?
Yeah.
And I think he grew up in a fairly standard Protestant German household.
Right.
And then after he does that, he discovers that all four of his grandparents were in fact Jewish.
What a great story, right?
Yeah. And I don't think he ended up at the very end, or probably halfway through his life, that he was particularly Jewish. But such a funny story, and also the precociousness of a 12-year-old getting to this point and making that kind of a decision.
So he abandoned all theology, all religion, in his I think in his 20s. His family left Germany, came to the United States, but he had the gift of being a native German speaker, fluent in English, so bilingual, and his own deep fascination with existentialism, which for him took him out of religion. So he was so fluent in German that when he went into the army during the war, he became one of the Ritchie boys. Have you ever heard of the Ritchie boys?
I have.
So the Ritchie boys were people who spoke the languages of the enemies, either Japanese, Italian, etc., and they were trained to be interrogators and translators and listen in. So he was one of the Ritchie boys, and he went to Germany to interrogate prisoners, and that was his.
I didn't know that.
That was his contribution to the war effort.
Wow.
And got his doctorate in 1 year at Harvard. A brilliant thinker, and then just began bringing texts into English that either been poorly translated and not understood. So we both know that Kaufman is highly opinionated, very acerbic, disdains everybody, jokes all the time. So when you read Kaufman, you're reading Kaufman on, but I don't know anybody better to read Kaufman on somebody, to read somebody on somebody than Kaufman.
The difference he made for me was a lot of the texts that I wanted to read that I found impenetrable, he actually created access for me with them. Yeah. And I think he spent pretty much the rest of his life after moving here teaching at Princeton.
Princeton, that was his
and
home.
then had unfortunately, an early untimely death, died at 59.
59, yeah. All right, let's talk about existentialism as trying to dismantle every philosophy, and that's something that you and I share as a starting place, and that is whatever ideology you believe in, whatever system, whatever your politics, whatever your psychology, you're probably wrong. That's where you have to start. Now, who's going to say, well, I believe in this thing, but I'm probably wrong? What that does, it introduces a skepticism so you can reinvestigate yourself, and then you realize not to trust any system. I remember when Jordan Peterson, whom I like, came out with 12 Rules of Life, I began suspicious. I'm going to look at these 12 rules and just assume they're all wrong, and that's how I read, as opposed to saying, oh, these are the 12 rules of life. It's and some were good, and some were a little bit banal. But whenever I hear about a system or a theory, I just have this existentialist trained that it's a little part of the story claiming to be the whole story. So that is an existentialist starting place. And so what, for example, Kierkegaard, if we want to start with Kierkegaard, we don't have to, he is out after Hegel. Kaufman says Kierkegaard devoted his life to fighting Hegel, or rather the shadow of Hegel. That's a great image. And also fighting the complacent Lutheranism in Denmark at the time. So any thoughts on Heidegger? I'm sorry, on Kierkegaard that you'd like to offer?
Well, I happened to mention Kierkegaard yesterday when I talked about the story.
Right,
of
the rags and the
Hagar.
mags. Did you ever hear that term?
No.
No, when I was in graduate school, we had to learn religious action guides and moral action guides, rags and mags.
Oh.
And I immediately understood how fatuous that idea was, but I just couldn't say that. Anyway, what are rags and mags? Does that name the dichotomy that you were mentioning yesterday?
Yeah, but what I was talking about really was this, his phrase, the teleological suspension of the ethical.
Right.
Because he wrote a whole book about the problem of Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, and this issue of how does a father suspend the ethical considerations of doing something like this.
That's called a moral action guide.
Okay.
Don't murder people is a moral action guide.
Right. Don't murder people is a moral action guide, but then Kierkegaard ends up saying there are certain circumstances when you have to suspend that in favor of something that is higher up in the hierarchy. And what's higher up in the hierarchy? Absolute ultimate faith to God.
Yeah, that's the religion. That's the
The
moral
rag
action
part.
guide and the religion action guide.
Right. So I reject that because I don't think that you can suspend the ethical in a situation like that. But it's an interesting idea and an interesting discussion. And of course, when the stakes aren't that high, I think that we can do that. I think we can use that to bridge a gap between something that may seem in opposition to our ethics or our morals, and we just decide to choose faith. But for the most part,
Wait. Are you and I both repelled by that idea?
of the teleological suspension of the ethical in the case of Abraham murdering his son.
Just in general, a person says, well, my religion tells me I should murder people, so I guess I should.
Yeah, I'm completely repelled by that.
We agree. Yeah.
And I think there's such an aspect of laziness very often with so much of this thinking. Here's a situation where I can suspend what I would normally say are my core ethics or my core moral beliefs. And I'm going to gravitate there because somehow the idea of faith puts me in opposition to that. And I say that's not a good enough excuse.
It's not possible. So that's where existentialism has an understanding of religion that for you and I is so clear, but it's actually quite unusual when the average person thinks about religion. That is not, it's not some other system that supersedes the ethical.
Exactly. And I think the reason why I inject the word laziness in this is I think because it's very hard to hold together two things that seem to be in opposition to each other. So we want to try to harmonize it or reject one and embrace the other because we don't like that vertigo and the anxiety and the despair that comes with having to really wrestle with things that don't reconcile well. And I say, well, that's part of human existence.
That's beautifully put. That's existentialism. People avoid the responsibility of reconciling seemingly irreconcilable opposites.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what we're supposed to do in life.
Exactly. And I'll tell you, with my Torah study group, very often there is a need to figure out which is the correct interpretation of something. And I try to gently persuade people that we don't have to choose, we don't have to eliminate, that there's something really beautiful and poetic about holding the two tensions together at the same time and understanding that one does not obliterate the other. And I think that's exactly how poetry works for us. The reason why we embrace poetry is because we don't, there's no goal in mind. So we don't have to get to a certain place and leave everything in contradiction behind. This idea of embracing some of the opposites opens up a door to finding out certain passions and dichotomies that make life so much more interesting. Yes, we can reject some because facts may change, and therefore we're able to see more clearly that one side works for us better than the other. But now I revel in the idea of things not being reconcilable. It's just so much more interesting.
We learned this when we studied Talmud and Midrash, because
exactly
the most common term as a Midrash is actually, people think it's a little story. It's actually a developed literary form that starts with an opening that tries to connect a faraway verse to the verse under study, and then several interpretations that are opened with davar acher. Here's another opinion, and they're not reconcilable. So
davar acher is a key to being Jewish.
That's exactly right, and that's existentialism. Davar acher, it might mean something else.
Doubting yourself.
Doubting yourself. Irony, sarcasm, doubting the idea of authorial intent. People say, well, what did the author mean? How would the author know what the author meant? It's one of my favorite quotes of Leonard Cohen. People say, what does this poem mean? Leonard would say, I don't know, I didn't write it. So you can ask the author what they mean? Like, no, they're the poet. They're not the literary critic, and most literary critics don't know what it means.
That's what you said about your nigun yesterday.
Exactly. It's just downloaded. I don't know where it came from. And I actually think it was a mistake. I think the download was aiming at something else. And I stood in the wrong place at the wrong time, because that was actually meant for a musical person. So anyway, this idea, now existentialism takes us there.
That's why Meirav, as the musical person,
translated
it for you.
That was actually meant for Meirav, right? Okay.
Who you hadn't met yet.
But we lived we were living there at the same time. Weren't we living in Jerusalem at the same time, Meirav? I think so. Meirav, but we're both living in Jerusalem at the same time. Anyway. So this idea that as you look for meaning, ultimately you have a choice to make. And that is just highly disconcerting, because they want to know, what does the text mean? For example, when a person speaks, they say, I mean this, and they can tell you their intention, which is far different from it means. Because it means is such we take for granted that whole world of what it means. By the way, this is one of the themes of Suzanne K. Langer's Philosophy in a New Key. And I mean, if you want to read a really difficult book, that'll pay off. And
at least it's short.
Yeah, it's short, and it'll take you a lifetime to read it, unless someone tells you by when you have to finish it. I'm rereading it, and I'm looking at my underlines and notes, and I'm so glad I'm reading it again. It is such a more rich book, and she's also very funny and very sarcastic. I didn't pick up on it the first time around, and if you look at the yichus of all these people, how they all go back. Oh God, I can't remember, but Leo Strauss and this one and this one and this one, they all go back to this one. So all these famous German philosophers, including Langer, her family came from Germany, like Halfman. She grew up speaking German because her family insisted they only speak German at home. So she spoke her whole life with a German accent, although she's born in the United States. But they all go back to a kind of an archetypal setting in Germany. Part of the idea, and this, by the way, veteran orator people will remember that I overused the term hermeneutics, and it became a joke at the synagogue. I didn't know any other words, so I started saying theory of interpretation, but here's the hermeneutical problem. When you interpret something, you are sitting in your context, and the text was produced in another context. So the question is there some method to get at the so-called truth? So hence, Gadamer's book, Truth and Method, which is ironic. It's a joke. There's no method to get at truth. There's no method to know what the text means. You try to recover the meaning. So then do we just stop? No, we have this existentialist vertigo that we have to make a choice. We have to master as well as we can, make a bid, invite someone else to the discussion, and in that discussion, it's a very existentialist idea, meaning will appear. We can discover. So I think for as we go into this, one thing we're bringing is when people say, "What does it mean, Rabbi Manning?" and you say, "We don't know what it means. Let's try to work it out." But let's be serious about language and study of language and study of terms, and not just throw in what I think it means.
Right. That's why it's important, especially with reading Torah or any important book, to read it in a way that you try to approach it with fresh eyes. It may be stories that you know by heart and stories that you've read 20, 30, 50 times. But when I read Torah, I first try to read an unannotated copy. Mm-hmm. So I keep one copy unannotated around me. And I really try to have that naive openness about how the language is speaking to me. And one nice thing about not being very good with Hebrew is that I try to read the Hebrew, and because I'm not familiar with the language, some things in the language jump out at me that wouldn't jump out to a native mm-hmm. Hebrew speaker. Mm-hmm. And so I see some things that other people would gloss over because they're overly familiar with it. Mm-hmm. So that's my approach also to reading our wonderful texts.
Yes, and you're right that people wonder how you and I can read the same text over and over again. Because there's meanings, and I'm going to say meanings under advisement, that are hidden. So, for example, when it became clear to me many years ago, when the Psalm 23, that was, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, gam kelech begay tzal mavet, that's what it looks like. So scholars say there's an ut ending in Hebrew that makes something conceptual. So there's, it's not gate tzal mavet, but gate tzalamut. Now, what is a tzel? Is a shadow. Tzalamut is a fancy ending in many times in Hebrew. It's like an archaic ending. So tzalamut means deep darkness. So wait, tzelem means shadow? I walk in deep darkness? Whoa, I go back to the creation story, that we are created in the tzelem of God. What if the author was being ironic? Like you all think, oh, but tzelem, all the organization is based on human dignity, and the author saying, that's not what I was talking about. I was talking about the irony of the human condition, that we live in the darkness of God. People, wake up. I read that. I said, I have no idea what this means, but I'm gonna take the idea that you remember this. We're going to start with we're created in the shadow of God. Let me start that as a hermeneutical starting point. I can justify it, and the things that it opened up when I thought the human being is created in the shadow of God, the Jungian shadow. That's, for example, an existentialist approach is I'm not going to accept the translation. I'm going to actually look things up. I'm going to accept another possibility. And I'm not going to say, here's what it means. And it's not subjective. Here's what it means to me. But there's a latent meaning, okay, that can be justified, that takes me in an unforeseen direction. So you and I both do, we've never talked about it, an existentialistly, a linguistic approach fueled by existentialism, because so many existentialists took the linguistic turn, that in Germany, in many ways, defined modern philosophy.
Right. And if we don't automatically accept, let's say, editing decisions or popular translations of the text, and we really try to look at it as if we'd never come across any of the words or the story before, then new ideas jump out. And I think that they're meant to be there. And the fact that we accept that the story has always been told a certain way and interpreted a certain way, like you say, that's one reason for me to object to it and see there must be another way to look at this. And in fact, you started a class, which I really loved, and I hope you go back to that, with reading the Bible this way. And it was vertigo producing and maybe irreverent to a lot of people and a little upsetting, but I think it really opens up a creative part of your brain. Let's not look at these stories with which we're completely familiar and just repeat the interpretations that we've heard for years and years. What else could be there?
This idea that God always has God's reasons, as opposed to thinking, as is so clear in the book of Job that you and I both love, I think the book of Job haunts most of the Bible, that what if there is a so-called demonic side to the God of the Bible? I'm not going to say God. That's a whole other discussion.
Right.
But the God of the Bible.
Character God in the
character
Bible.
God
the
in the
character
Bible.
God in the Bible that told Abraham to kill his son Isaac, or send out his other son and send out his other wife.
Right. Yeah. I have a book I refer to in Hebrew that is a graphic novel, and it has God dressed up like an Italian mafia guy, and his council are other mafia guys, and then a little angel that says, "You guys got to knock this off." And then a story happens, and they say, "Okay, we got to spin this one for the newspapers." So many of what we have in the Bible is just the publication spin on something awful that happened. I should actually bring it's in Hebrew, and it's unparalleled, the wit of these authors. But anyway, so just reading that graphic novel that I discovered in Israel, I'm going to say 25 years ago, it also opened up the Bible to me. The willingness to be playful, right? And many people don't want us to be playful with the Bible, and I think it's play. Did you ever look at Huizinga's the play element of culture? Have you heard of that?
No, but I know that you've spoken about that.
Yeah, just very briefly, he wrote a
Huizinga, right?
Huizinga. Yeah, I just mispronounced it.
I just want to make sure I'm thinking
I think
of the
it was
same
written
person.
he was Danish, wrote it in German, came into English, and when it was translated into English, the German translation is the play element of culture. And they said that's too obscure. They said the play element in culture, as if there's this thing called culture and there's play in it. And his point was all culture is play correctly understood, which is rule-bound activity that has a play between conformity and creativity.
Right, with an element of danger, but in a safe setting.
Typically, an element, so that's what culture is. It's regulated play. But then he said, war is play. Everybody says, we're here, you're there, and we're gonna wear uniforms, and we're gonna act in certain roles, which is why,
Like a chess game on a chessboard.
like a chess game, except people kill each other. And why guerrilla warfare is that's not part of the rules. Well, for us it is. Okay, then we have to learn anti-guerrilla warfare. So when he was writing these things, people were alarmed because they didn't like the word play used in this manner. But when you just accept how culture For example, why militaries all over the world are so culturally similar, right? There's something about preparing people for warfare where all cultures, when they pick up on why another culture is winning wars, they realize that they have to change their culture, right? Their understanding of the game. So we're not going to go down that road because I have too much to say about the
And I have nothing to say about military culture. So.
yeah, and not just the military culture, but like what is a battle? I'll say one word here.
No, go off on this tangent. This is interesting.
One reason that the German army had a rebel, this guy Guderian, and many others, that said the old idea that the infantry is supported by a tank, which is a roving piece of artillery. He said no. The tank is in the front, and the infantry supports the tank. Okay? And I think they said, well, we lost the last war, so why not? and the French could not get the idea because they so-called won the last war. So why would we change our play? And one reason the German army had such success in the beginning years of the Second World War is they said, let's just reinvent this whole thing called warfare. Let's just play by different rules. So this is how do you say his name?
Huizinga.
Huizinga. Anyway, so that's a great book to read. It'll change your thinking on everything, including how to study Bible. So I want to ask you a little bit. I've always been curious about how the existentialism took the narrative turn, because my introduction was the Camus, the Plague, and others, and I've never asked anybody, so I'm going to ask you for like The Stranger and The Plague. These are such odd books, but they're by an existentialist.
Right. So I think the first book I read of that genre was Camus' The Stranger, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it starts out Mother died today, or was it yesterday? And just in those two sentences, we see it actually looks like somebody who doesn't really care about something that he should care deeply about, his mother. Why doesn't he know if she died today or yesterday? And the kind of ennui and detachment that he feels. So it was an intriguing opening couple of lines. And then we find out that he, to me, then is one of the prototypical characters in existentialism. And what does that mean? Somebody who feels like a stranger in a strange land. And you mentioned this a few days ago about Moses being a stranger in a strange land. In fact, that's in our Bible. That phrase is in our Bible.
Ger anochi be'eretz nochria. I'm a stranger in a strange land.
Right. So what does that mean? And I think for people out there who are really struggling with what we mean by existentialism, if we can just try to define some of the terms, and if we can't, at least say what they have in common.
Okay, how about Heidegger's idea of thrownness, which is behind the stranger?
Right, being thrown into a situation that you have no control over, and there's lots of different directions that you can go in. So, for example, why is existentialism different from, let's say, nihilism? And I think, to me, existentialism says there's no sense, there's no meaning, there's no prior dictate of who I am or what I'm supposed to be. So I will create my own meaning. I will be the master of my fate as much as it's possible. So as opposed to nihilism, they accept the same precepts and say, so therefore life is meaningless. But I think with existentialism, if life is meaningless, then everything matters. And with nihilism, if life is meaningless, nothing matters.
Very well put. Thank you for that. So when I began studying existentialism, say if it's meaningless, then why is The Plague so meaningful? Why is The Stranger such an upsetting book? If it's meaningless, why are we upset with him? You know, I think the line before, was it today or yesterday, he goes to get a day off. He needs a day off from work. I need a day off from work because my mother died. Was it yesterday or today? So he's trying to get a day off. That's the most important thing for him.
Right.
Is getting a day off of work. And as he goes through the book, he's just cruising on the surface of everything. So people are judging him terribly, typically, as opposed to that's our position. Because once you get attached, so random, and you suffer loss and grief, and things don't go your way. If you want your work to be meaningful, and then you have a horrible boss, and you fall in love, and then the love falls apart. So just live on the surface. And so we are strangers. And if we go deeply, then we're going to suffer. And that's another part of existentialism, is just the willingness to face suffering authentically, which is why I so object when people say, oh, people adopt religion so they find reasons for their suffering. And I thought, that actually never occurred to me. To adopt religion, because I think what religion does for me is have me face my suffering squarely and give me a language for myself. I'm not avoiding suffering. I'm going to, not like the book, not like The Stranger, but I have a literature that makes me alert to suffering.
Right. So the protagonist in The Stranger really wanted to be numb because he felt the suffering so acutely. He just didn't want to be a part of a world that...
See, I think that's the right interpretation. And it's as it were, the preface to The Stranger, but you got to read it and get there.
You got to read it and get there. Otherwise, you think that he's an uncaring, unfeeling person who...
Yeah. It's just page after page of detachment, which is fascinating in itself, because it'll set something up, and you say, oh, now he's going to fall in love. Kinda. Not exactly. Okay, so the novelization of existentialism in
and that was the way in for me. I read all the novels before I then wanted to read about the philosophers that seem to also have existentialism as a theme in their work. I wasn't that much familiar with philosophy, so I had to learn a whole new vocabulary in order to even read philosophy, and that can be off-putting for a lot of people. Every genre has its own vocabulary, so if you don't bother to learn, and it's an effort, if you don't bother to learn the vocabulary, you're going to be an outsider anyway. So I wanted to learn the vocabulary because so many of these people write presuming that you know certain things and have a particular foundation, and if you don't, you're left behind, and then you're turned off by it, just like anything else that you want to study deeply. So reading Camus then led me to read Thomas Mann, who I really like.
Whom you know far better than I do. So talk a little about Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann,
yeah. Well, he was another 20th century novelist, and his protagonists were not similar to the protagonist in The Stranger. What he would normally do is set up a situation where we see two sides that seem to be incompatible with each other, and this can go back to Nietzsche and the influence I think that Nietzsche had on his writing, and that was that there is a strata of society where people are either will and rule and order bound, and then the other side that seems to be more chaotic, that is about living with passion and living with spontaneity and living with the excesses. So
and poetry and music and
all
and
of
so
the
forth.
arts, in fact. And Nietzsche describes this in The Birth of Tragedy, and he talks about the Apollonian side versus the Dionysian side. So the Apollonian side is the cool, orderly, structured,
moralistic.
Yeah. And the Dionysian side is more about living one's passions, discovering one's creativity. Usually in Hesse, who's also a contemporary and actually good friends with Thomas Mann, in his books, his novels, usually it's the woman who embodies the passion and the darkness and the flame. And
Was that his friend's mother, and Damien? The older woman? Yeah.
That was his friend's mother.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed all of this. I felt like an outsider myself. I didn't know anybody who was reading the same books that I was reading. And I didn't find myself in anything that I read until I had discovered existential fiction. And of course, all the protagonists are male. So all I could identify with was German protagonists in existential novels. And that became my whole raison d'etre. That became everything that I read. And then actually, when I discovered this Walter Kaufman edition of this Existentialism from
Yeah, go ahead and
Dostoevsky.
show it to the audience.
Dostoevsky to Sartre. What was wonderful about this book is that he actually provided a bibliography of all kinds of good books and essays and other things.
I have my
To read.
my other. Here you go. This was the edition that I read when,
Okay.
when I was in college.
So mine was $1.95. So if
I
yours
think you
was
beat me.
if yours was more money, yours was a later edition, I would presume. So I used this as a bibliography. Everything that Walter Kaufman put this together, the same Walter Kaufman that we were talking about originally, he edited this. And in fact, a lot of the selections that he put in this book were his own translations and the first time that things were translated into English. And it was little bite-sized pieces. So maybe I didn't get Karl Jasper, and maybe I didn't get Heidegger, and very difficult people to read and understand because I was still learning the language of philosophy. But I could get whatever was in a fiction form. So from that, I ended up reading a lot of Sartre. And then as I said, I read Thomas Mann, especially Magic Mountain was a life-changing book for me, but also his Stories of 3 Decades with the novella Tonya Kreuger in it. Really,
You've inspired me to go back to Thomas Mann.
I was almost going to bring it to you to loan to you, but the book is falling apart.
Yeah,
So.
I'll get it on Kindle.
And
So one Thomas Mann book, I read Death in Venice because I had to, and I started rereading it sometime during COVID, and it is so brilliant. A rather self-satisfied person who's looking at himself and he's a fraud, but then, well, I'm actually not a fraud. But that's fraudulent. And one level of another of a person picking apart his own consciousness, which produces a sense of vertigo about, and he's eloquent. I mean, he makes a case, and you say, "Yeah, you got it." He goes, "Actually, that's not true." So it's bewildering.
Devar Acher.
Yeah, Devar Acher is bewildering for the reader. And I think I was reading because I had to read it, and therefore I had to know like what the book meant, as opposed to luxuriate in the idea that we don't know who we are. We don't know what we mean. There are levels and levels to our consciousness. So that's part of what Thomas Mann in Death in Venice. And does he sustain that in the other writings as well?
Yeah, he does. He does. There's themes in every book that he's written that I see.
What about Tony Kroger? Give me the.
It's been a long time, but
what jumps out for you?
what jumps out is this idea that I brought up that really goes back to Nietzsche of the bourgeois patriarch of a family, let's say, as opposed to the passionate and confused and disorganized creative mother, and about how those two things are warring in each one of us, actually, hopefully, if we let them both escape into our consciousness. And how difficult it was for Tonya Kroger with the pressure of his father wanting him to conform to this bourgeois business life, and his mother taking him aside and telling him there's another way to live.
Yeah. That's a beautiful protagonist, kind of like in Damien.
Kind of like in Damien,
Yeah.
and also in a
By
different
Hesse,
way.
by Herbert Hesse,
Right.
by Hermann Hesse.
In a different way with Hesse and Narcissus and Goldman, which is another incredible novel that I recommend everybody read.
Okay. Another part of reading this. Let's talk about, everybody knows Nietzsche as an existentialist. Let's spend a little time on Nietzsche. So Nietzsche is angry, first of all, and he's literally brilliant. His book on his aphorisms, they're gems. He's angry because people turn to religion and philosophy for answers. And I remember one line in particular where he said,
For the laziness default.
yes, I will defer to a philosopher.
I don't have to think about this issue anymore. I can just accept this as a defining precept in my life. And boy, am I glad that I don't have to torture myself anymore about these ultimate issues.
And for me, that comes with also political ideology. I don't have to think as a reference group. I have a herd, and what they think, I think, because A, is convenient, and B, you don't want to get kicked out of the herd. So the existentialist cares nothing for the herd. says, you can follow me, you can follow each other, but I will follow the truth as I find it. And existentialists are typically very rigorous with themselves. One of my favorite lines of
Kotzker.
Jasper?
Like the Kotzker Rabbi.
Kotzker Rebbe is very existentialist. So one line I love from Nietzsche where he said, philosophers say they protect the truth. He said something like, if we rely on these mealy-mouthed milquetoasts to protect the truth is in very great trouble. They can't protect anything from anything. They're scribbling away their
and they get automatically attached to their own conclusions about things, rather than being skeptical of their own conclusions. And that's what I love about how you teach and all of these people that we're talking about with existentialism, this heshbon hanefesh that you talked about yesterday, this rigorous self-examination. You can't ever let yourself off the hook. Doesn't mean you have to make yourself miserable every moment, or this always has to be what is uppermost in your mind, but don't relax into a particular way of thinking and never revisit the topic again.
Yeah. You know, reading Nietzsche, I remember when I first read Nietzsche, in, probably I was in the military over in Okinawa, it was thrilling. It was thrilling because every page had a punch. Every page turned tables over. He's like, going into a museum and turn anything over and say, "Oh my God, you ruined it." Actually, that's kind of beautiful. What that you just tore a room apart and it turned into installation art. So it was thrilling for me to read "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." Was one of my one of those books where it shattered my not the house. I don't think my thinking was that particularly organized anyway. I was more Dionysian. I read it because I love it. I don't have to figure it out. But he gave kind of a credence to, we're just picking up jigsaw puzzles from the cosmos, and then you realize, oh, the puzzle doesn't fit together. And then you say, oh, wait a minute, it might fit together. And we're just getting pieces of meaning, and we don't. So do we quit the puzzle? We just keep trying to put the puzzle together. So for those of you who don't, if you've never tried Nietzsche, I want to say it's not coherent. There's no system behind it, except he says he has a particular animus toward Christianity, like Kierkegaard, because it creates, like Kierkegaard, the self-satisfied Protestant bourgeois. I have grace. I believe in the system. Jesus died for my sins.
I have a theology.
Yeah, and so I don't have to worry about my sins because someone else took care of it. Like, let him do it. Okay, so he looked at these people and he looks at Christianity and he sees the Bible is heartbreaking and it's disturbing and then he sees people that don't think because they're Lutherans. So this is Kierkegaard rebelling against his Lutheran society, and then Nietzsche comes in and continues that. Oh, by the way, the idea that Kaufman says that Kierkegaard was fighting the shadow of Hegel. Hegel was the great system, and people rebelled against him because it was such an all-encompassing system that he just created animosity. Now, I have not read anything of Hegel's back to back. I've read chapters here and there and selections, but whenever I read Hegel, I read it very slowly, which is one reason I've never finished anything, because I will find one sentence here and there that's just an existentialist gem. But he created great animosity because he had a system, because he tried to put it together. So part of what Kierkegaard was attacking was both religion and philosophy, and
any system.
Yeah, any system, and that's where Nietzsche comes in. So if you're daunted by the word Nietzsche,
what do you think is the best book for a person's way in?
I found my way through "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," what's the book with good and evil?
Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah, Beyond Good and Evil. I would suggest that one. And it's poetry. It's it's not. He's not building an argument.
Because when we read something and we see that there's a truth inside it, it automatically registers as poetry.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And you not even sure how the meaning gets created, which is why
we don't even know what it means yet. But we know that there's something there.
That's great. So Nietzsche, that's beautiful. He's creating meaning. We don't quite understand how. It pierces the heart. And the next page, he says, well, here's another way to think about it.
The soul says, hang on, you don't understand this, but we need to spend a little time with this concept.
Yeah. So Nietzsche, you read slowly. And so the problem is the I'm laughing because the Nazi culture appropriated the term Übermensch, the superior human being, and Nietzsche would first have been laughed and then been horrified, because the Übermensch doesn't wear a uniform. The Übermensch doesn't line up and all look the same. The Übermensch is the Dionysian. The person says, I'm breaking out of the system. I'm not putting on a uniform. I don't agree with anybody. I will follow my passions to find the truth. And then they dare to use the Dionysian renegade for themselves.
For the paragon of Aryan superiority.
Yeah. So when people say, but didn't Hitler like Nietzsche? So he never read Nietzsche. Are you kidding me? Right?
Just like the word Übermensch.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not what people think it is. So that's one thing. If people say, but how could you read Nietzsche? Because, Hitler liked him. I say, Hitler didn't read him, right? His profession was painting postcards. Okay, that's what he did. He was a watercolor painter of postcards, a frustrated architect, got brought into the carnage of
if he'd only been a little better at that.
That's what people say. If he would have been a little bit better, he would have done architecture and not destroy human civilization, or try to. Gets brought into the First World War, and he finds meaning in carnage and blaming somebody for Germany's loss of the war. And that just organized his consciousness as a young man, and some bizarre way got into power. But they were the opposite of Nietzsche. In
the
fact,
danger of charisma.
The danger of charisma, with a thoughtless person with no moral core, fueled by hatred, fueled by ideology, and murdered anybody who disagreed with him. It's so anti-existentialist.
And the appeal of demonizing the other.
Yes, exactly. You talked about that yesterday. There's a great appeal. That's why whenever someone someone says to me, "You got to read this person," and the minute I realize they're demonizing the other, I don't want to read one more sentence. And that's what our polarization is people demonizing the other instead of hermeneutically trying to understand the other, right? Because even if you don't like the way they think, I will read somebody hermeneutically, meaning I want to understand why they're organizing their life around hatred. What is the nature of their hatred? Why do they use those words which clearly do not match? Words should signify something. So, for example, we talked earlier when you came over about fascism. So, because I've studied World War II, I think I know what fascism means. Elimination of the free press. It comes from the word fasces, which means a bundle tied together. So we have to bundle up society. We all have to be in the movement. So they co-opt the military and the educational system, and everything is under one. So you can't have a free press and have a fascist society. You can't have a free press and a military with no political movement. So there are markers that are fascism, about 10 markers. And people say, oh, he's a fascist. By what definition? And they say something that has no relation to what the word typically signifies, but then people say, I use the word any way that I want. Think how dangerous that is. This is Humpty Dumpty.
Like Übermensch.
Like, exactly. We'll take the word. It will mean anything we want as long as we get to call those people that word. So the word is used for anybody that I hate is called this word. So that's one reason why it's hard to talk to people, because they have their own internal system of meaning. So we don't even have a common language. We don't have what I call a police
We don't have
report.
a common dictionary.
We don't have a common dictionary. That's exactly right. And so one thing the existentialists, I think, would do, this is the linguistic term, let's talk about language and meaning first. Do we have a police report? Right? What do these words mean to you? If that's what it means to you, here's what it means to me. And let's line up a vocabulary before we try to talk about anything.
And you teach this a lot about being precise with language,
Yeah.
and about making sure that my understanding of a word is the same as your understanding. And if not, how do we figure that out?
And people have arguments. Many times I see arguments based, this is going to sound crazy, based on misunderstandings of words. So the guy comes in, Rabbi Finley, don't you think a wife should? I say, according to whom? I said, what does your wife think it means to be a wife before you tell her what her life means? Just the idea that I will impose the meaning of your life based on my egocentric, self-centered needs. Okay, now let's talk. And it's like,
Right.
Yeah, I said, no, now
That's a non-starter
that's
for
a
a
non-
foundation.
That's a starter for toxicity. But many people walk in and say, shouldn't it be this, without any curiosity to the existence of the other person? So that's Nietzsche. Often when people talk about existentialism, they Nietzsche's in the back of their mind somewhere, Kierkegaard's in the back of their mind somewhere. And so what are they about? They look at a system and they realize it doesn't answer any important question. That the human condition, even that's why existentialists typically refuse the title and all have an aversion to each other. Because as
none of the existentialists would call themselves an existentialist,
Yes.
other than Sartre.
Yeah, other than Sartre, who invented the term, and everybody rejects it. So when
he got attached to it.
So and so he like label people, and I think you made a little joke yesterday. It's like forgiveness. We all use the word, but nobody knows what it means. Like forgiveness, whatever that means. We continue the conversation.
Right, but
So-
that was because you had talked
because
about how
I-
difficult it is to understand that concept, because what does it really mean?
What does it really mean? So that's Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. If you're wondering about them and how do you read them very slowly. They're not coherent. They're angry, and they want to puncture systems. So if you are attached to a system, be ready to be challenged. So how does that fit in with religion? Because people think of religion as dogmatic system. How can you be a religious existentialist? I'm actually asking you.
Actually, that was the question that I had when I first started reading this. When I found out that there were some religious existentialists, it made no sense to me when I was a teenager. How can you be a religious existentialist? Well, I think we can go all the way back to the story of the Garden of Eden with the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And to me, that is our first story about existential issues, existential angst. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about this and inject a little more Judaism into our existential discussion.
Let's do it. So from an existential perspective, they're thrown into the garden. I didn't ask to be here. And there's a rule, and you're in charge. I'm not. Maybe it's Garden Eden for you. It's not the Garden Eden for me. Just
and the only thing we know about them is that they're created in the image and likeness of God.
Yeah.
But what we encounter in them is nothing like the image and likeness of God. So what does that even mean?
Unless Sela means the shadow of God.
And the shadow in a sinister sense, really.
Either in a sinister sense.
Either it can be less sinister if we think of shadow as something that's a really poor subset of something, or an incomplete version of something. But also there's a sinister, because whenever there's an idea of darkness, we know that we attach something sinister.
Well, that's
to
in
it.
the Bible. The Bible attaches to darkness a sinister sense, like the plague of darkness in Egypt. It was a plague.
First there was this darkness and this chaos and void, and that
Tohu
was not
vavohu.
good.
Darkness and tohu vavohu. I mean, it's complete darkness and it's chaotic.
So we want to get rid of the darkness, first of all, let there be light. And we want to get rid of the tohu vavohu. So we're going to create order. We're going to do separations. We're going to create this as opposed to that. So there's pairs of things that get created immediately.
So you and I agree that...
And that helps get rid of our despair, our anxiety, our dread, all these words that the existentialists say. This is what we feel as being part of the human condition. This is not a symptom of neurosis or psychosis. This is what every human being feels if they bother to live a life of self-examination. So I really like that part, that these feelings of anxiety and depression and despair and dread are not symptoms of an illness.
That's great. They're not neurosis. It's encountering the human condition. And
this is being in touch with what it means to be human.
Yeah. This is where Viktor Frankl comes in, because he tells the story in...
the most extreme situation.
I'm thinking of when he got back to Vienna and he was a psychoanalyst, and he was counseling an American army officer who had a real problem with American policy. So he went to a psychoanalyst, and the psychoanalyst said, you have father issues. The American government stands for your father. So he goes to Viktor Frankl and he says, well, what if you just disagree with American foreign policy? It's not about your father. It's something else. It's your value system. And so that was one of the examples.
Take that, Freud.
Yeah, exactly. Take that, Freud. That's part of logotherapy. So this man didn't find me. That's why I like to say, meaning finds us. Here he is, trying to.
But you have to be looking for it.
Yeah, you have to be. Yeah, you can't be an automaton that says, the system tells me to do this. Just do
Can't
my
be
job.
in the matrix.
Yeah, we'll get there. So the person says, just do your job. What exactly is my job? Yeah. So that's that army officer in Franco. Let's go back to Genesis, because
Okay.
I remember when I it wasn't that long ago, maybe 10 years or so ago, that I began reading the first chapter of Genesis from an existentialist perspective. It just never occurred to me.
You taught that. It was great. I hope you go back to that.
Yeah, I think I will. I that's how I read the whole Bible now. But when it never says that the tohu vavohu and the darkness went away, meaning, yeah, there's this creation, and the darkness and the abyss and the tohu vavohu just got pushed out of consciousness, okay? And so it's still there, because there are other parts of the Bible where it says God boreh choshech. So we say to ourselves, where'd the darkness come from? You go to Isaiah, he says, oh, we forgot to tell you. Yotzer or uvoreh choshech.
There you go.
So now, did the author
Who
of
shaped light and created darkness.
Now, did the author of Genesis 1 know that text? Now we always have to bring in higher biblical criticism. So if I'm pretty sure that either Jeremiah himself or the school of Jeremiah wrote Genesis chapter 1 as a poem.
It's too much of a coincidence when there's those
when that
parallel wording.
Yeah, so the word tohu vavohu only appears in Genesis 1 and in Jeremiah.
Right.
That word paired like that never, only in two texts. So did Jeremiah read Isaiah? So what if when Isaiah says, Yotzer or shapes light, creates darkness, and Jeremiah writes this very cagey poem, Genesis 1, especially the word Tselem Elohim, because it might mean the sinister darkness of the divine. Now,
Or the brokenness, the broken incomplete part, or a really bad semi-replica.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. So if you take this, it's an alternate reading. It's not that Tselem doesn't mean image and Demut doesn't mean likeness, but if you say he was created in the sinister shadow, kind of like God. Bitsalmo udemuto. Demut was like kind of like. So try to read it that way. He was created in the sinister shadow, kind of like God. Now, I can sustain that translation with Hebrew philology. I mean, this is not a drush. I'm not reaching very far. I can show you biblical sources that support that translation. Now, when you translate it that way, you read the whole story
Everything
differently.
is different.
Everything is different, including the Garden of Eden. So now that I'm reading it that way, you remember this, that when the Garden of Eden story assumes the snake knows about the conversation between God and Adam and Eve. Did you ever think about that? Because the snake says, wasn't it told?
Sets them up.
Wasn't it told to you?
That was the first midrash I remember. That midrash changed my life.
Which one?
The midrash of the snake saying to Eve, "Weren't you told that that perhaps you're not supposed to eat of it or touch it?"
Mm-hmm.
And then the snake pushes Eve into the tree, and she sees that she doesn't die, and her whole world collapses. Right. So if that's not true, then what else isn't true? So from that, either we can figure out that Adam or Ha'adam repeated the story wrong to her, either was showing off or for emphasis
just
or
adding to it.
Or to build a fence around the Torah, let's say, or adding to it. And of course, then that becomes the first instance of don't add to the Torah.
Okay, this is so great because so it's a rabbinic dictum, build a fence around the Torah.
And don't add or subtract.
And you can't have both. So that drash is actually from, I think I learned it in, it's in the Midrash, but cited in...
Rashi cites it.
Yeah, and Pirkei Rabbi Elia, Avot Rabbi Natan, the Pirkei Avot, according to the school of Rabbi Natan, where that is brought down, that says, when you keep adding to law and someone says, but you can't support this by Jewish law, then they begin to doubt everything that you say. Let me just give you a real-life example. Meirav and I had an acquaintance where he belonged to a local Sephardi synagogue, North African or something, and women used to come after services and open the ark and do techinot, imploring God. And the rabbi said, women can't open the ark. And my friend said, is that true? I said, no, it's not true. I said, what does he cite? He says, Hilchot Sniut, the laws of modesty. So I have the Shulchan Aruch in my home. We pulled it out, went through the table of contents. There's nothing called Hilchot Sniut. I said, he's gaslighting you. Go ask him where it is written in Hilchot Sniut. He goes to the guy, and the guy goes, oh, okay, it's not exactly written. Can you imagine? And this crushed our friends. I didn't mean for it to crush his faith, but he didn't believe any of these rabbis anymore because they were just making it up as they go along, partly based on a little bit of misogyny. You know, I don't want women too close to my
Or what
territory.
his rabbi said to him.
Exactly, what his rabbi taught him. So that's a good example.
The parallel Lador Vador.
Yeah. Right, the sinister Lador Vador. I'll just keep repeating the lies that, you know, that
The
I-
Sitra Achra
the Sitra Achra Dor Vador.
of
So
preserving our tradition.
So that drash, whoever made it up, that when the snake said when don't eat of it and don't touch it, people say, well, where'd she get that from?
So the snake must have witnessed God's original instruction to Adam, and Adam taking Eve around the garden, showing her the way. He's the big hero here. He's the one who knows something. He says, you know, you can't eat of this one. In fact, you know what? Don't even touch it.
Now, so then I have the image that really alerted me, existentialist reading, like what is not said. So the conversation where God creates Adam and introducing the God of Eden, it doesn't tell us that the snake was standing right there, just listening to the whole thing. And God says, what are you doing here? Just listening. May I listen in?
Hanging out in the tree.
Hanging out, right? Now, the snake must have been there to be able to quote that conversation. I never heard anybody tell that to me. It's not in the Midrash. It's not in Rashi.
Let's do a little screenplay about that.
Absolutely. And where does God go? Where is God when the snake is talking to Eve? You know, and so the absence of God, right?
Having another bet with Satan.
Yeah, over writing the book of Job, right? How to torture human beings. Oh man, this is taking us into some disturbing territory. But you see, that's the existentialist reading is, I'm going to read the text raw. I'm going to take the linguistic turn and encounter things what they say. So, as you know, when I've given these interpretations, some people say, oh, wow, you're reading it in a raw primary way. And other people say, I'm very disturbed. Where'd you get this teaching? I said, I created it from reading the text. Well, don't you have to authorize everything by Rashi, the Midrash? I said, no, where'd they get it from? So some people have the temerity of saying something not authorized by the tradition. And now, an existentialist would say, who cares what the tradition says? I'm going to read the text.
The amazing thing in our tradition to me is that the book of Job ended up in our Bible.
I know. You and I both are blown away by this.
And so many of our stories have ended up in the Bible. It's amazing to me that the willingness to really see kind of the dark, sinister side of what life is like, what human beings are like, the unfortunate randomness and chaos, and also the joy of freedom and choice and possibility. And I think, unfortunately, rather than always picking a version that constricts our view of what's going on in the text, it's so beautiful and wonderful and empowering to pick these other versions and maybe even come up with our own. I mean, in my Torah study group, we come up with all kinds of different
Chidushim, beautiful. Right. By the way, Kaufman's favorite book of the Bible is Job. Not surprising.
Not a surprise.
Not a surprise. And this is where I always have to tip my hat to Jack Miles, because in his God biography, he retranslates the ultimate line of the
pivotal verse
of that's always mistranslated, and Jack Miles points out the Hebrew doesn't sustain how almost every translation translates the book of Job. And I said, he's right. And he said, just move the etnachta, the so-called pause, move it back one word, and then look what the words actually say. And
so share the verse, because this is important.
Oh, I wish I'd kept my Bible here, because I hate to go from memory. It's something like this. God fulminates, and then Job says something like,
This is the apex of
the end of chapter 41, I think.
Job confronting, reconfronting,
yeah.
not backing down, not accepting words that he thinks
Okay.
are
If anybody's
false.
listening out there, bring my Bible to me. Anyway, I'm going to try to do it a little bit offhand. So Job has this terrible, terrible critique of God, and God speaks out of the whirlwind. Where were you when the world was created, and what do you know? And you're just a measly human being, and going on and on and on and on. Okay. So I'm going to.
Nachamti. I think Nachamti is the word that
yes,
gets
that's one of the words, and also afar the
right. Dust and ashes.
Yeah. So you and I love this so much, and it's a core to our existentialist reading of the Bible and seeing who.
And how wonderful of Jack Miles to discover this and really explain it to where everybody can understand it, and how fabulous of the Pulitzer Committee to recognize.
And gave him the Pulitzer Prize.
Yes, God, a biography.
Yeah.
It really, he talks about God as a character in the Bible and how that character changes depending upon what part of the Bible, who may have been the author, and what the different stories are and how God is portrayed. Now, just that premise is upsetting to a lot of people.
Yes, when people say to me, I don't believe in the God of the Bible, I say, which one? Jack Miles has 24 different depictions of God in the Bible.
And the one in Job he calls a fiend.
That's the title of the chapter. So Job is saying to his friends who are saying, oh, by the way, can I just set up this up just 1 minute
Please.
differently? So they're up in heaven, and his ministers are walking around, and God says, did you notice my servant Job? And Satan says, yeah. God says he's like the apex of Proverbs. He's the guy who's Yahweh Elohim, and he's pure, and he's innocent. And Satan says, yeah, because you reward the good and you punish the evil. So it's not out of love for you. It's actually rather prudent. So I had the thought that there's a pause between, have you noticed my servant? God's looking around. Have you Job, for example, right? How random is that? Like, what in God's subconscious brought out that guy? So just try to imagine, have you noticed my servant? Oh, you. And then you become the story of Satan and God. Why you? Because he had to pick somebody.
You were there.
Yeah, you like, for some reason, you were there. Okay, so that's the story's generated.
You know, I'm going to interrupt you before
Please.
you go on with this. Thinking about Hagar this week, I had the exact same thought of God and Satan having another conversation about Abraham.
Yeah, great. Bring it down. Yeah.
You're gonna do the setup for Job, but the same thing. Oh, you think Abraham really loves you? You've rewarded him. You've done this. What if you take away something of his that's really important to him? And just like in the book of Job, it starts out small. It takes, well, not small, but first there is a restriction on what the Satan can do. Same thing in the Abraham story. First, it becomes about testing Hagar and testing him with Ishmael. And then later on, when he passes that test and Hasatan wants to create more problems, and he has another conversation, he says, well, what about the one that you care about the most? And what about killing him? Let's see if Abraham listens to you with that. So
You want it darker?
go ahead, Leonard.
Yeah, you want it darker? The first one is actually the end of the story. Abraham is racked with such guilt and such hatred of God. It's actually an act against God. It's all fabricated by Abraham. Just as God tested me to get rid of Ishmael, you want it darker? I'm going to make up a story where you did it to me to take out Isaac. And God says, I'm thinking, God says, wait, but he's the future. Not anymore. You're evil. You're fiendish. Yeah, I'm going to kill my son, but I'm also going to kill you. So
When did you think of that?
Before I heard the song, You Want It Darker, because when I heard the song, I thought,
Abraham.
and I didn't want to share it with anybody because it's too disturbing. It's too dark to imagine.
Right, but he's thinking, people believe in you, people trust you, but I know the truth about you, God.
Yeah, I know that exactly, Job. So again, it's a.
And of course, they're the only two people in the Bible that are referred to as dust and ashes too. So we're meant to think of Job and Abraham together.
So in Job, it's referring to Abraham. Yeah, this is an incredible thing. Anyway, so that's a dark translation. And again, it's not what it means. It's a meaning that occurred to me because I'm identifying with the Abraham of Genesis chapter 1, and we can't calculate the shame, the heartbreak, the crisis. We just say, oh, so he listened to Sarah because she was watching out for her son. I've given that drush. I like it. It's meaningful. Like, let's have some Rahmanis on Sarah. She's watching out for her kid. But I have dark, dark, dark interpretations, which is, at that moment, Abraham says
Abraham's going to save humanity from God.
Yeah, where Abraham is saying, I hate you. I actually hate you. And then Genesis chapter 22 is, some
binding of Isaac.
The binding of Isaac is actually, in an odd way, written by Abraham to show, I want to show you how horrible God actually is.
To show I have choice. I'm an existentialist.
Yeah.
I can create my own.
I can create my own story. And if God goes around testing people, I'll tell him to kill people. Let me kill the only person for whom your divine plan is working out. Let's see about that. Now that's very, again, it's not what it means. And the only reason I have this dark thought is because I took Abraham in Genesis chapter 21 seriously. Like, how did Abraham feel when that happened? I would hate God.
Right.
How did
arguably the two most disturbing stories in Torah.
In Torah. Yeah.
And how amazing our sages pick out those two stories to read for first day and second day Rosh HaShanah. It just shows you that there's people thinking about it that, yes, maybe they think this theology is for 99%, but 1% of you, I'm going to open up this door and you're going to be very disturbed, but it's really important for you to get a glimpse of this.
And I think to myself, when I was going through my existentialist phase, every time I heard a rabbi talk about Genesis 22, they always did a whitewash.
Right, it's about faith.
It's about faith. And look at Kierkegaard. I wish Kierkegaard would have lived after the linguistic term, because Kierkegaard would have said, it's not a religious action guide. It's a horrible, dark, existentialist narrative of the hatred of God. Whoever wrote that, I think, was very disturbed by the kinds of things that so-called God puts people through.
So why would the rabbis choose those stories for Rosh Hashanah?
Here's the ostensible reason. Because pakad, it says God pakad Sarah, meaning noted her. So we want God to poked otanu, like pay attention to me. Like, look at me.
Remember your promise.
Remember your promise. And the same word is used in the Haftarah for Rosh Hashanah, which is the story of Hannah and the birth of Samuel,
right.
That God pakad et Hannah because of her sincere prayer. That's the ostensible reason, and probably mostly true. However, I think now that you've chosen it for a pretty good reason, the word pakad, pay attention to me, Rosh Hashanah, God, pay attention to me, we're going to let it speak. And, once you're willing to accept the darkness of the text, and then something inside you says, you want it darker? Right? You want it darker? So it's just, I remember that when Leonard played that song for me, soon before he died, I told the story before that in August of 16, he called me and said, I'm getting ready to, what do you say, shed the coil.
Mortal coil.
I'm getting ready to shed the mortal coil. And
shuffle off.
I quoted Hamlet. Is that Hamlet? Yeah. I'm getting ready to shuffle off the mortal coil. And so August of 2016, so I go to his house and we're talking about his death. And then Leonard says, "Oh, you want to hear my latest album?" I said, "Sure." Leonard calls and says to somebody, "You want to hear my new album?" There's only one answer, right? It's on his Mac. Okay, he has it on his Mac, like in GarageBand or something. And I listened to it, and I said, "You finally did it. You finally did it, right?" Like the darkness of Leonard Cohen met sometimes he plays this penitent, "Oh God," and I'm so broken, and
the Faust.
Oh man, it was.
So he shook his fist.
Yeah, it's like I thought the idea was, I'm going to die and I'm coming after you. That was my sense. Anyway,
you have a lot of explaining to do.
You have a lot of explaining to do, exactly. Anyway, Job. So this is Job.
42:6, is it?
Art School writes the redemption of Job. Oh my God! Stop it, guys! Like quit drinking the Kool-Aid here. Read this text. So Job is complaining about God to all his friends. I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything to deserve it. You must have, because
So where's
God is
the
just.
justice in this, God?
And no one can answer. So God finally comes and says, I created the world, blah, 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 for like 2 chapters, how powerful I am. So what does Job say after God appears out of the whirlwind?
Yes, there's no dispute that you're powerful and you created everything, but that's not really the issue here, God.
Yeah. So Job responds to God. This is chapter 42, verse 1. Vaya'an Iyov et Adonai v'yomar. And Job responds to God and says, now the Hebrew says yadat, it has a karei kativ, which means how it's originally written and how they amended it. The letters Yud Dalet Ayin Taf is yadata, you know. But they add the Yud, I know. Let's just read what the Hebrew originally says. You know that you're omnipotent. And he's quoting something earlier. Don't
move on so quickly from that, because that's really important to say, you know you're omnipotent, rather than saying, I know you're omnipotent.
Yeah. You know, or you think you know you're omnipotent, right? So God is saying, yeah, you're agreeing with me? So, like, what's happening next? V'lo yibatzer mimcha mizima. And yibatzer means to withhold, like a drought is a batzoret. Nothing's withheld from you. We agree. All this showy story about creating the world and the rainfall, yeah, we know. He didn't even have to say all that. Now he goes on and says, now he's quoting God, because God says to Job over in 38:1, he says, God says to him, Mize ma'alim etza blidat. Who's this who ma'alim makes it dark? It makes dark counsel knowing nothing. Now this is a quote from what God says to Job back in chapter 38. Who is this person saying obscure things with no knowledge? Okay, so Job says, I remember what you said to me. Who's this person who says obscure things with no knowledge? And lachen higadati velo avin. So I realize now I'd said things I didn't even understand. Lachen higadati, I said things velo avin, and I did not understand them. Niflaot memeni velo eda. Stupendous things that I never realized. And then he quotes God again. He says, Shema na va'anochi adaber, eshalcha v'hodeni. Listen, this is what God says to Job. Listen here, let me speak. I'll ask the questions and I'll tell you what's up. Eshalcha, I'll ask you, v'hodiani, and you're going to answer to me. This is what God says to Job. So Job says, okay. He quotes it back to God. And then Job says, here it is. Leshema ozen shematicha. I heard about you. Can you imagine? I heard about you.
That's a pretty brazen statement.
Okay. V'ata einai ratcha. And now I've seen you. And then
we start out naked, now God is naked.
Exactly. Now here's what the Hebrew says. Al ken emas, and therefore I am disgusted. The nichamti, which can mean regret or have compassion upon. Okay, it's the lirachem in the nifal. Okay, so they say, I repent. It can also mean I have compassion.
I pity.
I pity. Al efar ve'efer.
Dust and ashes, which means mankind.
Which means humankind. So they have to add in, I repent because I am. It doesn't say that here. All it says is, therefore I am disgusted and I pity humanity. That's what it says.
And the way that word nechamti has been used up to this point has only meant pity.
Right. Mm-hmm.
In the book of Job.
In the book of Job, correct. So it's one of those words that has a range, which is the mystery here, because it...
But not mysterious in this context.
Not in this context. And also for Job to say, I've gotten it wrong the whole time. I kept saying, yes, God is just, but I don't deserve this. So explain it to me.
Right.
And he's like, my whole premise was wrong.
God is not just.
You're not just. You're evil. You're a fiend. You're bad. Right? So Job's the first one.
And then what does an evil entity do when being confronted this way? Turns around and excoriates the friends of Job, who did nothing but put forth the God's party line.
I know that is so amazing that God turns to his defenders and said,
Your fault.
Your fault.
You're the bad guys.
Yes. Immediately shirks responsibility.
It's so much worse.
Yeah. And said, I'll just read it. It was after God spoke these words to Job that God said to Eliphaz the Temanite, which is the head of all the friends, he says, Hara api b'cha. I'm really angry with you. I have wrath toward you.
Because he didn't like being cornered by Job. Wanted somebody to blame.
Yeah, and so he says, what was it? B'cha uv'shnei re'echa. I'm really mad at you and your two friends. Ki lo debartam elai nechona ki'avdi Iyov. Like, because you didn't speak correctly about me as Job does. Like, you just want to do a somersault back. Like, what did you just say? I'm mad at you because you didn't speak properly about me. The whole book they've been defending God, as does my servant Job. Job is now the servant of God who's confronted God. It's so deep. It's impossibly deep. And my interpretation is the arrogant person just tramples over other people.
Right. It's really a teaching about what we do ourselves and the gymnastics that we go through to evade responsibility. And that's why it's an important text for existentialism, because making decisions and taking responsibilities for the outcome of those decisions is the one basic tenet that every existentialist
take responsibility. So how can God possibly say this? So I put in the long pauses, which you can only do cinematically, where God's looking at him and says,
how do I get out of this?
I think God's saying, thank you. Somebody finally busted me. Thank you.
God never speaks again in the Bible.
I could squish you right now.
What about that?
Yes. We're relationships. So I'm downgrading this relationship. But think of the David and...
I don't have to live... The day that the Wizard of Oz is confronted,
yes,
I don't have to live with this weight of...
The facade.
The charade of who everybody thinks I am and what I've constructed in the minds of others.
Exactly. Look at David and Nathan the prophet.
Yes.
David's the king. He's horrible. This is in 2 Kings 11, if you want to look it up. He's contrived the murder of a fine officer. He more or less rapes his next door neighbor. Yeah, exactly. And there's a cover-up going on. And Nathan the prophet comes and he wants to talk. Prophets have access; they can just walk in and it's like a tradition where the king
says, he tells a sweet little story to David.
Yeah, you want to tell the story with the analogy he gives? You remember it?
I do, about a man a very powerful man with a lot of assets who owns many sheep with many ewes, and there's another man who only has one little ewe, and the powerful man says, "I want your ewe," and takes it.
Yes. And David said that man should be killed. And Nathan says,
Ata ha'ish.
You're that guy. And pause, because David remembers, I'm the king, and I can lop off his head.
Right.
Or he can say, I've been finally found out, and I don't have to, just as you said, I don't have to maintain the facade.
Yeah, well, see, I don't think that God reacts even in as heroic a way as David does, because David would then turn around, if the stories were parallel, and say, it was actually my first lieutenant who went and got
exactly.
the ewe. Right, it's his fault.
Yeah, God can't come up to David, but it's such a...
And everybody, just keep in mind that this is character of God in stories. So
it's
please
character.
don't be
exactly.
offended by...
These are depictions.
This isn't what I think of God. This isn't what Rabbi Finley thinks that God is.
This is theater. Try to imagine you're sitting here and Job quotes God a couple of times, who's talking and doesn't know? And then he says, I heard about you, and now I see you, and I pity humanity. Long pause. God says, I'm mad at you guys because you didn't speak correctly about me, as did my servant Job. and the audience is going, "You fake! You
Right,
can't
just
even."
more confusion.
Yeah, and then we realize
Smokescreen.
he doesn't show radical responsibility. So
Exactly.
okay, so
and David does.
and Job, I'm not doing the party line because the book of Proverbs says, if you are Yarei Elohim and Tamim Drachav, if you're God fearing and righteous in your ways, you will be
There's
exempt.
an equation.
Yeah, and Job says, well, if that's true, and I've been reasonably righteous, how do I justify my suffering? It's a reasonable question. And now Job has taken radical responsibility. And he says, because his friend said, well, then there must be a secret sin. You know, people say, I know why this is happening to me because something. People have an explanation. I'm suffering. I have throat cancer because I didn't speak up. You know, I mean, I hear people saying this kind of Course in Miracles thing. Everything has a cause. As an existentialist, I really have to hold my breath when people say, or about somebody else. They must have not spoken up.
Agreed. I always
Whoa.
think of that. What happened with the I think it was a school in Israel.
Mm-hmm. The
And something-
massacre of 27 children.
Right, and a rabbi went around and said that they had defective
Mezuzahs
mezuzahs
on
on
the
the door
Right.
post, and somehow there was a cause and effect.
I know.
It kills me
it-
and breaks my heart really, and
it-
and makes me angry.
Yeah, it's breathtakingly awful when that rabbi said that. It's breathtakingly awful. Oh, God, that was awful. So here, who's Job? Job's the guy that says, okay, everything I believed is wrong. But at least right now I got it right. Look at the...
So how did that get into the Bible?
Exactly. So when people say, I don't believe in the God of the Bible, I said, it's not what it's about. It's about the book of Job. It's about the most...
And look what we've done. Every single translation pretty much whitewashes it, reinterprets it in a way that's completely contrary to the plain meaning of the text with an opposite outcome. It's that we cannot sustain having our heroes be seen in a non-heroic light.
So we are
complicit.
shirking the truth because
Right.
people can't just... And I don't blame anybody if they don't know Hebrew.
Right.
And I remember when I read the translations, this just doesn't add up. I mean, I had suspicions until I read Jack Miles. And then I just read the Hebrew.
Confirmed.
This is all Jack Miles did. Read the Hebrew, and this story actually makes sense. God never fully develops. God is never fully actualizes in his admission. God never...
Not at all.
Yeah. But he kind of does.
I don't think so.
Oh, I think when he says, you guys had it wrong, Job did, is that good enough? Do I have to actually really apologize? Or I am God. I can't...
But I think at that point, whoever's listening to that doesn't understand this reversal, doesn't understand it at all. I think by saying that, it's not an admission. It really is a tactic to create confusion and let's move on.
Okay, we see it differently. That's great. I see it as...
And I'll tell you why. To this day, being called a friend of Job is a slander. And really, all the friends of Job did was really try to follow what God had said is how they should believe, that this belief in the Deuteronomic theology, that there is cause and effect, that there are some things that I can count on. One of those is God's justice. So now the friends of Job, to this day, that's a metaphor for false friends.
Torturers. They won't accept his experience. He said, look, I had an experience. I'm a good person. This makes sense. Oh, come on, Job.
There has to be something.
There has to be something. You must have done something. Come on, search your unconscious. And then God says, I'm mad at you because you didn't speak like my servant Job. And Job's going, well, what? And the audience says, wait, you're saying this whole time he's
and I'm
been
going
right?
to throw a bunch of new children at you and
Yeah.
money and everything
Yeah,
else
and
like
I'm
that,
gonna-
and all will be good.
And I'm
and
going to
let's
get out of
move
this
on.
story. I need to exit the stage right now, right? So I actually have a feeling this is like burlesque almost, where God goes, you're wrong, he's right. Here's your children. Here's your money.
The end.
The end. I'm off the stage. That's my take on it. So yeah. So this is it's so existentially dark and painful and acute that people have to mistranslate it.
Right. We can't take the truth.
So now here you and I. So why do you love the Bible? Because they put the book
So
of Job
who?
in.
And I know that there was a lot of discussion about whether it should go in or not, but who got that final vote? And how did they persuade people who were worried about God's reputation to include something like that in the Bible? Or did they think it's going to be mistranslated?
It's a great discussion. Right? And all I can say is, look, he said, this is too dark for some people. How about if we like futz with it a little bit? You know the term hamivin yavin v'hamaskil yidom. You know that?
No.
Hamivin, the understanding one will understand it,
Oh,
and the wise one will shut up about it. Okay, hamaskil yidom.
okay. So there's a little club of people that are going to get it,
Yeah.
and the rest of them are going to take a
Yeah.
more innocuous
Yeah.
meaning from it. And
Yeah, but hamavin yavin, the truly discerning one, they're going to get it, and they're going to shut up about it. Hamivin yavin v'hamaskil yidom. How are we doing on time?
we're quarter to
We're
12.
quarter till. I love this because how you can be a religious existentialist? Because if we take the linguistic turn in existentialism, which is radical responsibility for how you read the text, don't accept others. So you have to read Hebrew or read Jack Miles. Encounter the text anew. And the meaning of the text just flourishes in a dark way.
And don't
But-
be afraid of what direction it takes you in.
Exactly. It's exactly right. This is
And maybe that's the lesson from the book of Job. Maybe this is our sages saying, you're so afraid of our heroes being tarnished, but we put this book in the Bible so that whatever you think of the text, don't be afraid of where it takes you as long as you are pursuing it honestly and with self-examination and with an open mind.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why
this
it's
is
in
the
there.
advice to the reader. Exactly. Now, this is one depiction of God because if you read Psalms, there's a whole other depiction of God. So when I want comfort and
Right.
meditations, I look at Psalms. But when I want existentialist,
When you're filled with existential angst,
I go to Psalms.
or Kohelet.
Yeah, or Kohelet. Yeah. Or,
That was the book of the Bible that really opened the Bible for me. That was the book that provided entry, was Ecclesiastes.
same here. And there's also whitewash at the end of Kohelet.
Right.
End of the matter, all being said, like, just remember to do the party line. That's another one. I want to soak in your theory that it was put in. Remember, like, that's like what it means. We don't know what it means. You have a theory.
No, I just thought of that now.
I know,
so
I know you did, but I want to pause a moment that they're telling us how to read the Bible.
Right.
They're telling us how to read
That
the
it's
Bible.
okay to go into some dark chamber.
Yeah.
And that's why we put the book of Job in the Bible.
And then you realize, you ask yourself, as I did, can I read other parts of it
The
dark?
same way.
And it's not. I'm not comforted, but it leads me to truth. I'm not defended from the human condition. I don't try to find reasons for everything. When people say to me, "God put me here for a reason," I said, "What if not? What if this is completely random? And now what do you do? Don't look for the reason in it, but look for your duty." That's my little aphorism. Do your duty. I don't know if God
Or
put me here for a
create
reason.
meaning.
Yeah, I don't know if God put me here for a reason. I don't know. But I know now that I'm here, I have duties.
And somehow I have a sense of right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow there's some morality that is not just constructed. I feel that.
And that's when I say whenever I do theology, starting point is moral realism. I mean, Sartre didn't become a nihilist. I mean, he became a Marxist out of a moral
No,
concern
just the
for poor.
opposite. I think, World War II.
You have a quote there for us?
Oh, I don't know. I have a good quote from Michelangelo.
Oh, great.
The greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but that it is too low and we reach it. And there's
So you got to slow that one down.
the greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but that it is too low and we reach
Oh my
it.
God, that is so beautiful. Nietzsche says something. He says, I tried to quote it, "It's easy to have courage of your convictions. The real courage is to respond to your attackers. Courage of my convictions, at what price?" But
Right.
But-
That's a closed loop.
that's a closed loop. But like Habermas, or now go seek someone who disagrees with you. How do you have enough? And that's one thing I'm so disappointed where people don't have the courage to actually engage in an honest conversation.
Well, that's what Jasper says, that you can arrive at some conclusions about things, and then you have to seek out somebody else who has the opposite. And maybe the synthesis or what comes through that kind of discussion will get you closer to the truth.
That's Talmudic machloket, by the way. That is based in the Talmud. Here's a teaching. Here's the opposite teaching. That's what the Talmud teaches. So I'm so surprised by and then if you don't like Talmudic ethics, then just go to Jürgen Habermas. So many people are devoted to the Frankfurt School. And then, well, how much of a follower of Habermas are you where you can't sustain discourse with someone who disagrees with you? So that's one of my naivete and disappointment that smart people don't have the courage to confront someone who disagrees with them in an actually civil and honest way.
I have to tell you a funny personal story.
Okay.
You know that one of my big heroes in my life, probably the biggest hero in my life, is my father,
Yes.
and who was a very smart man and a thoughtful person. And starting from when I was a young kid, if I would have arguments with him, or there would be an issue that would come up, or something that I had read and I thought about, and I wanted to talk to him about it, and he would start out with one opinion. And then by the end of listening to me, whether it was the 8-year-old me or 12-year-old or 16-year-old, very often he would say, I see things now completely differently. I've listened to you and I've changed my mind.
Yeah. I know. What a role model, Sherry.
Was shocking to me and empowering to me. And also what that relayed to me was what a huge responsibility I had with how I use my ability to argue, that I could have that kind of an effect on somebody. Because some people, most of us, we define a position that we have and we just defend it.
Mm-hmm.
And defending it has nothing to do with thinking about it again. It has to do with, like I said in the beginning, about the laziness of arriving at a conclusion and never wanting to re-examine it again. And my father was always willing to re-examine what he believed in or what he thought the truth was. And I thought, I better be careful. I better be careful with how I do this. Look what kind of...
right in Pirkei Avot, be careful with your words because you don't know the unseen consequence ramifications. I wonder if there's any chat. So I'm wondering if
people probably have questions.
Yeah, they might. So we got 11 minutes left. And
okay, I'm going to do one more quote, and then let's do... Here's the quote
So the producers, if you see any chats, maybe you can...
or people can raise
their
their
hand. Yeah, we're looking over at the screen here.
I had never come across this Michelangelo quote. I just came across it yesterday. And then it made me think of a quote that I use all the time. My group is very familiar with me saying this, and this is a Robert Browning quote. A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?
Yeah, I memorized that in high school. A man's reach should exceed. Yeah, I remember. Is that existentialist?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Because the whole idea of embracing your passion is go beyond your reach. Go beyond what society tells you should do, or any dogma or any theology. Go be willing to think beyond, be willing to challenge. The boundaries are artificial. And if you go beyond, there's things out there that you can't even imagine.
Yeah. So let me actually close formally our song Le'ela that we took from Moshav Band. What is Le'ela? In the Kaddish, it finally says, Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata. It's beyond every poem, song, hymn, and a nechemta is an Aramaic word for a sermon. So a nechemta is like a compassionate sermon, like a nechemta,
Yeah,
a
I see
consolation.
how it's related to...
Yeah. So it's beyond, it's like le'ela u'le'ela. So now that we've talked, le'ela, it's beyond our reach. Our reach is going to exceed our...
And that's why Havruta is so important.
Yeah, I'm so glad we took the time for
Thank
this.
you.
And I think we just kind of touched on it a little bit.
barely did anything.
We barely got anywhere here, but it was great. All right, so now I'm going to turn over to the screen, turning to the camera, and I want to see, are there any... Now, we can only have a very brief question, one sentence with a question mark. Okay, so Ruth, very, very, very brief question. We want to make room for others.
the idea that with all of the things you pointed out today about the deviousness of God and so forth, yet what remains finally is the level of trust that God had for the human being, that we could go through all of this and still believe.
Okay,
That's
okay, pause for everybody listening. Depiction
Yeah.
of
God as a character
God
in
as
that
a
story.
character in the Bible, constructed as a literary character by an author in a certain place of time to a specific audience. We don't know what they meant. All we can do is read the text. So if you're going to read Job, and if you're going to read it darkly, then go over to Psalms and read it as a source of radiance, love, and light. So it's not one depiction of God. So there are some times...
And it's not God.
And it's not God. It's depictions of God. Therefore, I think you have to come at the text with...
So it's not heresy.
It's not heresy. It's existentialism.
But it shows the ultimate trust in the human being to be able to handle all of it. And that's what's so special.
Okay, so pause your question there because my contrarian is coming out. When the rabbis mispunctuated and everybody mistranslates Job, that's not trusting the human being, right? They don't trust us to read it as it is. And I've read so many translations of the Bible that don't trust the reader.
Right.
Right? I mean, would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I did want to say one other thing about one other book that was really life-changing for me, and that was The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And there's a big section in the middle of it, about a 100-page section, which is called the Grand Inquisitor section. And the Grand Inquisitor, his rationalization for doing what he does is because he doesn't trust mankind to be up to the task. And he understands the definition of what should make mankind happy. And therefore, he wants to impose this kind of constrictive control over humanity. So what you're talking about really is not trusting us to be able to read and handle. And also that we may confuse the God in the Bible with the God that is God.
Yeah. So here's a chat. Our shadow, our reflection of God's shadow. For example, this is Schopenhauer. The God we create, I'm talking about the authors here, is a projection of their inner lives onto the so-called sacred canopy. And then we look at the sacred canopy and we say, oh, that's God. It's depictions of God.
It's the finger, the Buddhist finger pointing to the moon.
Exactly. When you point at the moon, don't confuse your finger with the moon. So always remember, literature is aiming for something, and we read it from an existentialist perspective. We don't say, oh, that's what the book means. We're willing, and this is, again, the linguistic turn of existentialism. I have a core starting point when I think about God. That's when I
and we challenge that all the time, even our core starting point.
Once I understand...
You always say you have just enough theology to kind of hang...
my spiritual psychology.
Right.
Exactly. Right. So, again, why did I adopt Kabbalah? Because I understood that religion is an array of myths and symbols to aim at the obscure hiddenness of the inner life. And when I read Kabbalah, I found a poem that worked for me.
And because brokenness is what pierced and spoke to your soul.
Exactly. So it's an existentialist decision to love a poem that spoke the truth of human brokenness. That's what does that say about? I don't know what it says.
Thank you, Shanti.
Yeah. Okay.
For introducing poetry.
Yes. Here's a comment. Our creative examination is inspiring. Yeah, we're inspired by this.
Thank you, Rabbi. You have inspired me for 28 years
and appreciate it.
Enabled me to go beyond anything I even knew was in myself, even with this background, because I didn't know it would include Judaism and Bible.
Yeah, and that's what we're hoping to communicate to all of you. Thank you for that. And you, Rob and I have just watched you assume a natural position as a rabbi. And all we did was affirm what was true. So you're amazing. Thank you, rabbis. All right. Layla and Deirdre, so great to see that you guys are here. Yeah, we should...
One other question?
Okay, and David and Diana. That looks like Diana there.
Okay. Yes, I'm going to ask, I've asked before,
when are you going to lead us through the book of Job?
When are we going to lead you through the book of Job? Is anybody running off? Because I have all day. Yeah, I think our challenge, Sherry, is to do this more. Now, we're not going to have
Dialogue
this
more.
wonderful group because it's not going to be second day Rosh Hashanah, but we really should do it. And you know what? We'll put it up online, and it'll be there for the generations. But I think it's
Yikes.
yeah, I know, yikes, right? That's why we say you get the recording that's good for 7 days. Because I say, what if I don't
Like
believe that anymore?
Snapchat,
Yeah,
really.
yeah. All right, we're going to Snapchat. So yes, we're going to rise to that challenge. Would we do a book group online? And you can share with all you've been saying this to many people. Mirav and I feel like we're finally settling in. We turned a corner. Reasons beyond our control. We're thrown into the human condition.
The
where
thrownness.
The thrownness where either we retire and move on, which we could have, or accept this as the most
Adapt or
creative,
die.
the most creative period of our lives.
Wow.
Right? Look at this. This is the studio we're sitting in. Built with our meager funds. It was enormously expensive, but it's a decision. We are going into the most creative chapter of our lives.
You're all in.
We're all in. And so people say, can you do this? Can you do that? We're open to everything now because of the liberation of space and time, right? So everything is possible to all your questions. And, it's been an interesting couple of years, including health considerations.
Yeah,
and
really.
we both feel like we're just entering into the best. The best of life for which the first was made. Is that Browning?
I don't know.
It's somebody. Okay. Thank you. Another wonderful compliment. Yes, existentialist book group and reading Bible stories from an existentialist perspective. I just want to say existentialism for me includes the linguistic turn. So in the 1920s, Karl Barth, Christian interpreter of the Bible, Paul Tillich, they're all talking to each other. And Heidegger, they're all taking the linguistic turn. Let's look at language itself.
Right.
Let's look and Ernst Cassirer, whom I brought today, and I
don't know him.
Okay, so let me plug Ernst Cassirer. Because for me, he wrote this book in 1944. He wrote a
What's it called?
An essay on man.
Okay.
So he wrote a 3-volume theory of symbolic forms, which is just too dense and unreadable for me, and I think for most people. He had a very serious debate with Heidegger, and I prefer Cassirer much more to Heidegger. There's a book called The Time of the Magicians, is a wonderful, entertaining guide to the Heidegger-Cassirer debate. Okay, table of contents: the crisis of man's knowledge of himself, the clue to the nature of man, the symbol, the human world of space and time, the definition of man in terms of human culture, myth and religion, language, art, history, science. So what Cassirer has done is taken all that knowledge from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and put it. So I think this is essential reading for the language turn of existentialism. Produced some of the greatest theories of language, which of course brought me into religion. It's a sacred system of myth and symbols, which brought me to Kabbalah, which of course brings me to this very moment. So Cassirer is one of them.
We can start with a novel that everybody will enjoy, and maybe have this be book number 2.
Okay. Or a TV show. We're trying to think of that. An existentialist, Breaking Bad, if I may.
Breaking Good and Evil.
Yeah, Breaking Good and Evil. The Walter White has cancer and can't pay for it, can't pay for his treatment. And his memory is that his business partners betrayed him. And he deserves their money. So Walter White says, if that's how it is,
This is the world I'm going to
I'm
construct.
going to get some money. I'm going to get my own money because he he sees this crack thing going on by a former student of his who doesn't know chemistry. Walter White says, I know chemistry. I should be making crack
I'll make
cocaine.
the best
I'll make
crack.
the best crack cocaine. So you see the first couple of episodes, the like, oh, that's what it's about? It's about money? I didn't know. I heard about you, but I didn't know you. So, okay, I'm a chemist. It's about money. I'm kind of adding things up here. So that's actually the only part of existentialism and Breaking Bad. The rest of it is the fall of man. Okay, Israel Sussman is raising your hand. All right.
Remembering the philosophical meetup and philosophy meetup you used to have?
Yes.
Maybe we could do something similar, like once a month.
Thank you. I had a philosophy meetup, right? And it went down to 5 people per meetup. And I would rather spend my time doing this kind of stuff. I have 500 members. Nobody shows up. I think I'm a good teacher. So I got to try it again. And I'd love to do this at my philosophy meetup. This would be a great way to do it, to do the meetup here, have you here. But it really, it has to be worth my time. So yes to all the ideas of keeping this conversation going. So we are over time, but I'm looking at the screen, which means I'm not looking at you. And I just want to thank all of you for showing such interest. It's very validating for us, right? Yeah.
Well, we'll have to look at the number who showed up at the beginning and the number who stayed
right.
till
How
the
many
end.
people left right away? So Dennis and Barbara Lee, Arthur Shane, thank you. Ruth, David and Diana, Denise Kaufman, thank you for showing up. Sherry again, thank you. Tova Bonham, thank you.
But not a surprise with this congregation
yeah.
that if they show up for you, that
yeah.
they would be interested in this.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Judith Gable, great to see you again. You have anyway, thank you so much. And agreeing with our in the chat, go to the chat. Sarah Megan Heller put a good chat up. So I think we got
figured it all out.
We figured it all out. Now that we've seen it, we have complete understanding, systematized knowledge.
I
no
know
more
you.
questions. Yeah. Now that we've seen the system, we have nothing to add. We're just gonna rehearse
The
dogma.
end.
This has been really, really inspiring. A conversation long overdue. And I think what we're hearing from you guys is raise your hand if you agree. If you're online, do more. Is that the consensus? Yeah. Okay. Look at that. All right, everybody. We're signing off. What's the song that you thought might be a good theme song for the darker side of existentialism?
Suicide is painless.
Suicide is
The
painless.
theme
from MASH.
song to MASH.
Yeah. So we're gonna think of a song list. All right, everybody. Take good care. Shana Tova, and thank you for joining in our vision. And clearly, it has responded in the hearts of our
eavesdropping
community.
on something that's been important to us for a long
Yeah.
time.
Okay. Shana Tova.